Hello, I'm Nathan Carlin. This is Life and Work. Life and Work is a series where we talk to scholars and intellectuals about the connections between their public scholarship and their personal lives. Life and Work is supported by the McGovern Center for Humanities and Ethics. Today on Life and Work, we're talking with Professor Andrea Jain at Indiana University at Indianapolis about a number of things. We're delighted to have her on the program today. I am, especially because she's a personal friend. We went to graduate school at Rice University in the Department of Religion. Maybe we can start there, Dr. Jain. Can you tell us a bit about your educational background, including Rice, but anything you'd like to say?
Sure. So before Rice, I went to Southern Methodist University in Dallas, where I'm from, and I started as a psychology major because I wanted to study religion, and I was interested in the psychology of religion, but I had no idea what the field of religious studies was. I thought to study psychology of religion, I needed to get a degree in psychology. But soon after stepping onto a college campus, I realized that there were other disciplines in which I could study religion with the theories and methods that most interested me that were really outside of psychology. So I ended up adding philosophy as my second major, and then eventually, halfway through my undergraduate education, discovering religious studies and adding that.
So you were interested in psychology of religion before college?
I was, actually.
Why?
Yeah. Well, I grew up going to some conservative Christian schools and studying the Bible, reading the Bible, taking Bible classes. And I was always interested in understanding the Bible as a social construct, as something that was created out of a certain social context. And understanding, the Bible in terms of different readings and different interpretations, which was sort of unusual and radical for a little kid growing up in Dallas, Texas. But this was always an interest of mine, and in high school I got interested in psychoanalytic readings of texts and started reading Freud and Jung. I was pretty nerdy from an early age. So when I went to college, I knew I wanted to be a professor, and I knew I wanted to.
Oh wow! Okay.
Study psychology of religion.
Yeah, it seems kind of unusual for a high school student to have those kinds of interests. Why do you think you were interested in religion at such a young age, and not just religion in the sense of kind of being religious? What I hear you saying is you were interested in the study of religion at a very young age. Why do you feel like that was the case?
Yeah, well, I, first of all, had a sort of complicated religious background myself. My father was from South Asia and was raised in a very Orthodox Jain family, whereas he immigrated to the U.S. in 1970 and felt very disillusioned with his religion, and so he left it entirely behind. And married my mother, who was a white Midwesterner who was raised in a Baptist church that wouldn't marry them because he was from India. And she ended up...
So overt racism.
Yeah. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so they ended up getting married in the local Presbyterian church.
Really?
And we loosely identified as Presbyterian growing up, but never had a church home.
Uh-huh.
And so I had this kind of this family story of religious displacement on both sides. And then I went to, like I said, conservative Christian schools where I myself felt out of place.
Yeah.
I didn't ascribe to a lot of the things we were taught about the Bible and about Christianity and about other religions. And it made me motivated to be in debate with my Bible teachers by studying the text. And
so you had some kind of I don't know if suspicion is the right word, but let's just say suspicion of religion because of the personal sort of pain you saw both in your father and in your mother. Is that?
Yeah, I think I had suspicion of especially kind of Orthodox religion.
Of Orthodox religion,
mm-hmm,
sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And so what was it like having an Indian father and a white mother in Dallas, Texas?
Yeah, so I was raised in a very wealthy, predominantly white neighborhood, a gated community. I went to predominantly white schools. I was often perceived as Hispanic because have brown skin. Growing up in Dallas, people assume this about you.
Oh, because it's Texas.
Because it's
Yeah.
Texas.
Yeah.
And so people were often uncertain of what I was. And at home, the aspiration was always to perform whiteness. That, we were a family that was white, or at least aspiring to be. But that wasn't my experience at school or out in the public, where I was perceived as other. Again, either as Hispanic or as Indian. And when people knew I had this South Asian background, they oftentimes exoticized me and thought, I had all these stereotypes about what it meant to be Indian that didn't resonate with my experience at home. So it was just a kind of perpetual feeling of alienation.
And so you sort of wanted to understand that, because religion seemed to be at the root of this, or at least a big sort of component.
Yeah, religion was a strong force in terms of how people identified in the place where I grew up.
It was important in the lives of other people as well, and how they interacted with you.
Yes, and wanting to locate me
Yeah.
in their narratives about religious identity, religious belonging, and religious commitments, and how that demarcated the good and the bad.
Yeah.
I held a lot of unconventional views about women. I resisted conservative ideas about women's place being in the home.
Mm-hmm.
I, from a very young age, was uncomfortable with homophobia, which was very normative in my neighborhood and my school.
Homophobia was normative.
Homophobia was, right.
Yeah, okay.
And these kind of gender and sexual norms were always uncomfortable for me, and for me were related to religion.
Yeah, that seems right to me.
Mm-hmm.
So that makes a lot of sense to me, that you would want to go to college, you'd want to study religion and the psychological reasons about why people are religious, or why they act the way that they do, or to maybe understand yourself, understand your family. All of those things make sense. And you knew you wanted to be a professor, and so you end up at Rice. Why Rice? Why did you want to go to?
There was one reason I was drawn to Rice, and that was Jeffrey Kripal, who had written a book called Collie's Child, which I read when I was as an undergrad.
Did somebody assign that book?
No, I read it for a research paper I was writing.
Wow. Yeah.
And
just for our audience, that book is it's an incredibly technical book, and that's why we're both laughing here. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a psychoanalytic study of a Hindu saint by the name of Ramakrishna, and the kind of work that Jeff did in that book, or Professor Kripal did in that book, really represented the kind of work I was interested in doing myself, the kind of psychoanalytic analysis of religion. And so I came to Rice to study with Jeff.
And what was that like for you? What was your experience at Rice?
It was like coming home. Feeling like I had a community of intellectuals who respected my interests and encouraged them. And I became very close to Dr. Kripal as a mentor. And even though I eventually branched out and ended up leaving psychology of religion for an interest in more social theory, and eventually wrote my dissertation on yoga and yoga's popularization, I was still deeply supported at Rice and had a strong group of peers and mentors there.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a good. This is a good segue to talk about your first book on yoga, which was related to your dissertation and published with Oxford University Press. Can you tell us about your first book?
Yeah, so my first book is Selling Yoga, From Counterculture to Pop Culture. And this was based on the dissertation. The dissertation was heavily ethnographic, though. I traveled a lot to India and did interviews among contemporary practitioners of yoga. And then I also did ethnography here in the U.S. and in London. And with the book, sort of cut back the ethnography and expanded on the social theory to understand yoga as a sort of religion of contemporary culture, and more specifically the intersections between yoga and capitalism, and thinking about the ways in which contemporary consumers buy commodities that are deeply religious. And so I make the argument in that book that commodification in contemporary culture goes hand in hand with religious practice. So what we often think about as mere commodities that people buy and sell for utilitarian purposes or hedonistic purposes, that these commodities actually have religious purposes and meanings in the lives of those who consume them. So I used yoga as a way to sort of demonstrate that argument.
And what does that look like? So I understand that if I buy, as consumers, maybe I buy clothes or makeup or a car, and so how is yoga like buying a car or clothing or something like that?
Yeah, so buying yoga commodities can be just as much about performing one's status, right? If you buy Lululemon, the high-end yoga wear apparel, you are performing a certain class status.
I see.
Yet, you're not just performing class status. You can also use that certain garb, like religious garb. When you put it on, it creates a certain mood. And in that mood, you enter into a sacred space on the yoga mat, which also demarcates a sort of special space that's set apart from ordinary space and time, where you focus on the self and cultivating certain ethical values. So that's where the commodification goes hand in hand with religion, where certain commodities can serve the same ends as religious temples or spaces or communities, spaces that are deemed sacred or set apart from the ordinary.
Yes.
And where the focus, you have these communities where individuals are bound to one another through shared values, through shared ontological commitments about the self and the body, and what liberation or salvation is. Shared ideas about history and shared narratives. So, for example, in many yoga communities, stories about yoga's origins and stories that convey authenticity are really important. This is all in addition to the rituals.
So did you find that in sort of, I guess, your ethnographies when you talk to different places, whether in India or United States or London or something like that, people would have a different origin story of yoga, and that was somehow important to how they were performing yoga then? Or
Absolutely, because it oftentimes, the way they told the story of the origins of yoga or their particular school of yoga, it tied them to the community and to a particular teacher or guru or a particular yoga system or movement. And so it's what bound them together.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that you can kind of see these dynamics in different places. Different religions obviously have origin stories of their religious founders, whether it's Jesus or Muhammad or whatever leader you want to sort of kind of identify with. And then in medicine, we have a lot of talk now about professional identity formation and stories of prominent physicians. Certain physicians hold a certain kind of sacred status, like William Osler or something like that. Or we have texts like the Hippocratic Oath, which sort of functions as kind of a religious creed. So I can see how particular forms of yoga would take on this kind of religious status that you're talking about. Is your project? Is it sort of like is it descriptive, or do you make judgments too? Kind of about the relationship between yoga and capitalism?
Yeah, so in the first book, Selling Yoga, I bracketed a sort of normative assessment of the commodification of yoga and its popularization. And instead in that book, I really wanted to understand how yoga became a part of pop culture and how it is made manifest in contemporary society as a sort of religious space.
Okay.
I didn't offer a strong critique in any normative sense of capitalism or commodification or cultural appropriation. But that's what I ended up doing in the second book, which is forthcoming with Oxford. And it's called Peace, Love, Yoga, The Politics of Global Spirituality. And so that's where I take the popularization of yoga, and I offer a strong critique of neoliberal capitalism and the ways in which what I see as deeply problematic capitalist ethics get transmitted through practices like yoga and mindfulness.
I see. So the first book is sort of descriptive. Second book is critique. And I guess the subtitle is pretty fascinating, Politics of Global Spirituality. So, like, I mean, do you see a problem of just sort of like, I don't know, I don't know if this assessment is right, but it just comes to mind, like, I don't know, kind of white liberal hippies sort of doing yoga. Is there something wrong with that?
Well, there's not something inherently wrong with it, right? It depends on how they're doing it. So, for example, in terms of cultural appropriation, yoga is historically a South Asian practice. And South Asia was colonized by the British. So there should be a sort of sensitivity around cultural extraction and how white cultures have gone into South Asia and extracted their resources of all different kinds, and then profited off of them. And this is extremely hurtful to South Asians economically, socially, culturally, and personally. And so if white consumers are appropriating yoga without a sensitivity to this history of colonization and to the impact that it has on South Asians, then it is problematic.
That makes sense to me. I mean, it's kind of interesting. It's sort of like it would be very offensive for sort of white people to dress in traditional African garb, wouldn't it?
Right.
Because of the history of slavery in the United States.
Right.
But whenever we see sort of white people, I don't know, are there traditional Indian sort of either clothes or mats or something like that white people might use?
Well, I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
Consumers of yoga oftentimes will use Sanskrit as a way of marking their commodities. So, for example, the Om symbol they wear across their T-shirts or on their yoga mats, which is a Sanskrit symbol.
Yeah.
Or they'll take deities. Like Ganesh, the elephant-headed deity, is a popular one among yoga consumers. And you'll see pictures of Ganesh printed across T-shirts or on yoga mats or yoga bags, yoga water bottles. And without attention to the role that Ganesh plays in South Asian cultures. And so it's like taking Jesus and plastering a picture of Jesus across your water bottles and your T-shirts and your yoga mats in a culture that's not dominated by Christianity, where there's not a real understanding of who Jesus is or what the context is.
That's interesting. And I wonder if white people sort of get away with it in the United States because it was Britain that did the colonizing. Like, it's a step removed. Like, in the United States, it just wouldn't happen, or I don't think it would happen with sort of African garb, because all of that sort of oppression sort of happened in the United States. But you see what I mean?
Yeah, or, I mean, the yoga industry is huge in Britain.
It is,
and it takes very similar forms as it does in the United States.
And there would still be this lack of reflexivity or lack of awareness that this is...
Absolutely. And in a lot of popular contexts, there's a lack of reflection on cultural appropriation and colonization. And so maybe it's that racism gets expressed differently or is tolerated differently depending on specific histories. So, for example, in the United States, there's still a problem of police brutality against black people that is tolerated and is very common, right?
That's a good example.
Yet, white people dressing in traditional African clothing might not be. And so, the form that racism takes depends on specific histories and
yeah. That's an interesting question about sort of what's tolerated and what's not, and in what context.
And so I think that with yoga appropriation, it is tolerated because of Orientalism, like the specific sort of Orientalism, how South Asia was perceived as being rich in spirituality. Mm-hmm. And so it was this resource for Westerners to tap into and benefit from in terms of spirituality. And so they've always been extracting spiritual ideas and practices and symbols and putting them to their own uses.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So that's one level of critique. What's another sort of angle of critique in the second book?
Yeah. So there's already been several studies by sociologists and religious studies scholars critiquing popular spirituality as a sort of numbing device, mm-hmm. something that numbs us to the pain and violence done by capitalism, mm-hmm. On the environment, on individuals, on communities. And what I try to do in this book is offer what I think is a more nuanced critique, still influenced by feminism and Marxism, but I don't see popular spirituality as made up of a bunch of dumbed-down consumers who are being numbed to their own suffering.
Kind of the Marxist critique there.
That's a more kind of classic Marxist critique. What I see is consumers who are very much aware of their own oppression or suffering or the violence of capitalism. Consumers who realize that they're exhausted by work, that they are constantly called upon to work more for less, that see how capitalism is destroying the environment and causing a climate crisis. And so they want to resist, but they do so through gestures. And so in the Peace, Love, Yoga book, what I do is I talk about gestural subversion in spaces like yoga studios and mindfulness courses. And what I mean by that is we are uncomfortable with the ways in which we're in pain or suffering or tired, in the ways we're seeing the environment destroyed around us. But instead of fully subverting or resisting, engaging in political action to dismantle social structures, capitalist social structures, in order to prevent this kind of suffering, we wear a T-shirt with Peace, Love, Yoga printed across it, or we buy biodegradable paper plates from Whole Foods. We join spiritual communities that talk about peace and good vibes, and that donates a certain percentage of profits to charitable organizations. Mm-hmm. And so there's an acknowledgement, a recognition of poverty, of suffering, and environmental destruction. But we gesture toward these things instead of actually engaging in radical political action. Mm-hmm. And so it's not quite that we're numbed by yoga or mindfulness. It's that it enables us to perform our resistance, but in a safe way that's not really actually dismantling any oppressive social structures.
I see. Yeah, it's sort of like, it's kind of like a bohemian bourgeois kind of, they can feel better about themselves if you shop at sort of Whole Foods and wear clothes not made out of leather. And
we can perform our anti-capitalism, or we can perform our pro-environmentalism without actually in a meaningful way, making a difference in sort of a meaningful kind of way, or an effective way,
or effective way. Sure. So I'd like to loop back, towards the beginning of the conversation again, why yoga? Why do you think? Is there a personal reason? Do you feel like that you have written 2 books on yoga now?
Yeah, so it's funny. a lot of people think that I must really know how to do yoga, and that I must be some kind of yoga master because I've spent so many years studying yoga. But I actually don't do yoga.
Yeah. Have you ever done yoga?
I've done yoga.
Yeah. Okay.
I took a yoga class in college, and I certainly have practiced yoga doing ethnographic work, especially as a graduate student. But I prefer being on the outside of my subject's space. So I prefer observing, and I use a lot of social theory in my work, which puts me at a distance from my subjects, rather than being a participant observer and doing that kind of ethnography. And so why yoga? It wasn't because I personally was attached to yoga or had any sort of personal history with it. It was because I saw yoga as an opportunity to talk about larger themes in contemporary society and religion and capitalism that were of interest to me. I was wondering, how can we theorize religion? What is religion in the contemporary world? How does it take form? How does it work to perpetuate social norms or uphold certain social structures? And yoga has been a really effective way for me to address these bigger questions.
Yeah. It's interesting, and to study yoga in the way that you do, so it's not as though you're just studying kind of yoga in India, but to study sort of yoga in a multiracial, global context, in a way, I guess, is sort of to study yourself, not in terms of yoga, but your own personal background, of a way of coming to terms with what does it mean to have an Indian father and a white mother in sort of Dallas, Texas. It's sort of, in a way, I could imagine this as being, a much more sophisticated sort of take on your own kind of personal history. I mean, does that feel right to you, or is this?
So where you and I connect is in, being in the same graduate school program because we were both interested in psychoanalysis and religion. And so I am committed to this idea that we are shaped, deeply shaped in conscious and unconscious ways, and we, by our past and our childhoods. And I joke that, why yoga? Does it have to do with the fact that I have a father from India? Well, probably has a lot to do with it. I might not be fully conscious about how the extent to which it does or how exactly it does. But certainly I'm a product of globalization, and as is the popularization of yoga and the global dominance of neoliberal capitalism. And so I am certainly aware that my own identity is wrapped up, and my own kind of struggle to understand myself is entangled with my attempt to understand these global practices. I'm a product of globalization, just like yoga is.
Yeah, and it would be, what I hear you saying is that it would be sort of premature to say that you fully understand these connections, but you kind of acknowledge that there are connections.
Absolutely, yeah.
Sort of there. So, moving forward, when you're finishing your second book now, and I imagine you have ideas about sort of where you want to go in the future. Is there going to be yoga part 3, or what do you think?
Well, I think I'm going to shift away from yoga for a little while.
Okay. Yeah.
I am, I'm a comparativist. I'm interested in religion from a comparativist perspective. I want to understand.
What does that mean? Can you explain to the audience? Yeah.
So I am interested in theorizing religion. What is religion? And so rather than being interested in a particular region per se, primarily, I was trained as an expert in Indian religions. Yet more than that, my training was in theories of religion and theorizing religion itself. And so my professional trajectory has been such that I've been trying to theorize religion as a capitalist phenomenon. And I am not wedded to the study of yoga. Yoga, like I said, has just been a really helpful way for me to theorize religion under the dominance of capitalism. And so I'm interested now in exploring other areas of culture. And I'm especially interested in questions around religion and the body generally. So, in what ways do body practices manifest religiosity? So, in what ways do we exercise our religion, our religious commitments, or engage in religious rituals that are about embodiment and what we do with our bodies and the way our bodies are situated in particular societies and cultures? And so I'm, increasingly interested in especially the ways that the discipline of religious studies itself internalizes certain norms. And so, like a religious institution, the discipline for the study of religion has norms around the way we talk about bodies, the way we talk about sexuality, and the way we study bodies and study sexuality and gender, and the ways that different bodies perform and are received in the discipline. Mm-hmm. And so I'm interested in asking questions around censorship, who gets censored, and who doesn't, who can talk about sexuality and religion in certain ways and who can't, and who gets published and why. In the study of religion, mm-hmm. and how that relates to certain kinds of embodiment. Are you in a woman's body? Are you in a man's body? Are you perceived as transgender or as sexually radical or deviant? Mm-hmm. And how does this connect to what you're able to say or not say in the study of religion?
It's interesting. It's you are a woman, and so what is it like for you to be a woman in the academy? Do you feel like that it matters?
All the time.
All the time, yeah.
I mean, first of all, I feel very lucky to be a woman in the academy in the 21st century because I have opportunities and a recognition by my colleagues the importance of reflecting on sexual politics and gender politics that my predecessors didn't have. And, it was much harder to be a woman in the academy even just 20 years ago than now. So I feel very lucky, and, I feel like I have, in a way, a responsibility because I've been able to get tenure and get published to talk about gender dynamics and sexual dynamics in the discipline and the disadvantages that women and sexual minorities have historically experienced. For example, and this is not just in academia, but in all industries. For example, being a mother and trying to keep up with one's colleagues while giving birth to children and raising children and nursing children, mm-hmm. And the expectations of keeping up with regard to publishing and teaching and service, all of these demands on an academic woman when also trying to be a mother and raise one's children. It's really hard.
That's an interesting question. The being a mother and in the academy, and you've been at Indiana University for how long?
About 9.5 years.
9.5 years. Mm-hmm. And when did you get tenure there?
Let's see. That was in 2015.
Yeah, so like 4 or 5 years ago, something like that.
Right.
Yeah. So you got tenure after 4 or 5. That's very, fast. That's accelerated. So it doesn't seem like being a mother held you back at all.
Well, it didn't, but only because I didn't sleep.
Yeah.
I mean, I was
You feel like it has held other women back.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I was advantaged in many ways by having supportive colleagues, and I.
And I see. And you're like maybe 20 years ago, mothers wouldn't have experienced that kind of support from colleagues.
Certainly wouldn't have experienced that kind of support, and still, many institutions don't offer father's leave, which is putting mothers at a disadvantage. There are many academic couples, many women who are married to other academics, and if their co-parents don't get leave or get a very small leave,
then
that puts the burden
on the mother,
right? And so there's still all sorts of disadvantages. And I mean, even when I came back after my very generous, by American standards, maternity leave,
How long was that?
A full semester.
Oh, full semester, okay, yeah.
I was still nursing And that, I traveled to conferences with my children until they weaned. And I was able to do that because of the resources I had on hand. But that is really hard to do. And it was hard on me. It was exhausting.
Sure. Yeah.
And it took a toll on, something had to give. Something has to give. And so if it's not your academic work, in my case it wasn't my academic work, but it was my personal life. I had to give up time to rest, time to spend time with friends, time to spend time with family.
Yeah. So it was sort of just relationships that suffered.
No, sure, because something's got to give.
Something has to give.
Yeah, demands are too heavy.
Yeah. And do you feel like something needs to be different?
Well, I think we need to think about structural changes in the academy.
Yeah.
Like providing more leave time for parents, both men and women and transgender.
Yeah.
And providing more support for parents, families of all different kinds.
Yeah. It's interesting. I was up in Canada a year ago or something like that. And it was, shortly after, had the birth of my daughter, and I was talking to the Canadian academics about paternity leave and so forth, maternity leave. And in Canada, they give a full year off. And I think it's at like 75% salaries, something like that. And I think the man or the woman or whichever partner, if it's two men or two women or for adoption, I think one partner can have a full year off, and then the other partner additionally gets, I don't know if it's 3 months or what it is, but both have some ability to have time off. And I guess that's what you kind of would hope for in the United States.
Yeah, that could really revolutionize the academy, because many women leave the academy before getting tenure because when they have children and it's just too much.
Yeah.
So could really have an effect on the gender dynamics.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's also all sorts of gendered and sexual politics at play in academia. For example, the politics of citation, right? I mean, we now have the evidence to show that women are less likely to get cited, which makes it all the more hard to get tenure. And we're largely in my discipline, religious studies, we're in male-dominated departments a lot of the time.
Sort of male department chairs. And,
right.
And the full professors are likely to be male. And, Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And so this plays out in all sorts of different ways that, like I said, I feel very lucky to be working in the 21st century, yet there's still a lot to change in order to make things fair and equitable.
Now, to shift the conversation a little bit, and we can kind of continue with some of these themes as well, I imagine, you are also the editor of the Journal of the American Academy of Religion.
Yeah.
And that is the flagship journal of the field. What do you like most about being editor?
I love being editor of the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, or the JAR, as we like to call it in religious studies. And that's mostly because, I guess for two reasons. Number one, I get to read so much in the discipline that's outside of my immediate subfields. And so I get to read submissions on everything from yoga to evangelical Christianity, and theorizing religion from anthropological perspectives, psychological perspectives, sociological perspectives, historical ones. I get so much intellectual stimulation as the editor, getting to read all of this incredible work, and I really feel like it enhances my own scholarship because I'm exposed to so many great ideas and great material. And so it's the reading that is so extraordinary and beneficial to me as a scholar. But then also being connected to people who are doing some of the most provocative and exciting work in the discipline on a daily basis, whether I'm talking to authors or reviewers or members of my editorial board, is really exciting to me. And I love having those connections, and then that sense of of being able to have a perspective on the discipline that gives me that has such breadth.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So it's been great.
And what do you see about religious studies now? Because you have a special vantage point. Very few people, get to see everything that sort of comes into the journal. I mean, anybody can see what's printed in the journal, but even that, you see what's coming in, and that's a special view. And also to how many people sort of kind of read every issue from cover to cover. I don't know how many that would be, but you would be one of them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So. What as a field? What are the sort of contemporary kind of key issues? I guess what's most important about the study of religion right now, from your perspective as editor?
Yeah, well, I think that what is most important about the study of religion is the ways in which scholars of religion can help us in this historical moment, which is a fragile moment. We are facing a climate crisis, the threat of nuclear war. We're dealing with political conflict that is incredibly anxiety provoking. And so I think as scholars of religion, we have an opportunity to analyze what's happening around us in this contemporary world from the perspective of religious studies. Like, in what way is religion playing a role in political conflict and the environmental crisis, and in what ways is religion effective in bringing communities together and enhancing the quality of communication and cooperation, and in what ways does it obstruct to these things? Yeah. And so some of the most interesting and I think important work that I'm seeing submitted to the JAR is work on themes like religion and environment, religion and racism.
That's interesting. I mean, the connection between sort of religion and the environment. That's interesting. Maybe the average person wouldn't make a connection there. What is the relationship between religion and the environment?
Well, religious people have always had ideas about the environment, right? Whether it was, God created this environment that we live in, the natural world, and we are then its caretakers, or we are meant to dominate and control it. There are all sorts of religious ideas about our relationship to animals and whether or not animals are to be, again, dominated and consumed or whether they're to be cared for and respected. And so there's work being done in the discipline on the history of these ideas, but also on the direction of these ideas, and as religions are changing and adapting to the current moment, how are attitudes and approaches to the environment and animals and to the crisis of environmental degradation changing. And so there is no one relationship between religion and the environment, but there's as many relationships as there are religious institutions and religious communities. And so again, some of the interesting work being done by religious studies scholars is in demarcating the ways in which religious institutions or communities uphold certain practices or norms that can, in some cases, perpetuate the environmental crisis, and in other cases, resist forces that are leading to the environmental crisis, or that have led to the environmental crisis. And so, this kind of better understanding of how we got here, right, can only help us in making decisions about how to move forward and survive if we are to it all.
Yeah. So religion's sort of an ambiguous kind of force.
It is. There's nothing like inherently ethical or non-ethical about it, right? Religion can be both deeply unethical or deeply ethical, deeply helpful or deeply problematic and destructive.
Sure. Yeah. So as editor, you get all this sort of interesting kind of latest material that you're exposed to, and then you also said the relationships, whether it's people on the board or individual scholars and so so forth. Is there a particular sort of relationship that you've made since becoming editor that would be interesting to sort of talk about intellectually?
Yeah, well, I have so many actually, but a couple notable ones. I mean, I have a great group of associate editors who work from a variety of different disciplines. Zain Qasim, who works on Islam, and Lee Schmidt, who works on American religion. Melissa Wilcox works on gender and sexual politics and American religion. And I get so much from them in terms of guiding me and helping me make decisions about the journal. For example, Amy Hollywood and Zain Qasim recently helped me curate a roundtable on the work of Saba Mahmood, who recently passed away and was an amazing anthropologist who really helped us understand secularization and the ways in which secularization processes have served to privilege certain communities over others in our contemporary society, global society. And so that was an amazing opportunity to create a conversation of scholars who came together for a roundtable to discuss not just Mahmoud's work, but the direction of the field now that we have Mahmoud's work to digest. Like, where should we go after Mahmoud? After we know about the what she provided in terms of understanding secularization and its relationship to religion, and so my associate editors and my editorial board, my book review editor Kevin Shelbrack, who works in philosophy of religion, and one of the key questions he asks is, in what ways has this subdiscipline of religious studies been dominated by Judeo-Christian questions and concerns and assumptions, and in what ways has it failed to account for other ways in which philosophy of religion is done in other religious traditions, and so seeking to kind of bridge or expand the philosophy of religion. And they have all helped me think about the direction of the journal and what should be prioritized in the journal, and the kind of critical questions to improve the discipline, not just maintain it, but take it in important directions.
Yeah. It's interesting. I'm struck by that the communal nature, sort of the kind of intellectual sort of journey here, of just establishing sort of forums at a given university around a particular scholar's work, and the conversations that you get to be a part of in that regard. That's pretty interesting. It's sort of related to sort of seeing journal submissions sort of come in, but it's much more I guess dynamic and relational whenever you think about sort of conferences or forums.
Well, like in everything we do in academia, we have a choice with regard to how we're going to approach it when we have power. We can be an authoritarian and say, I'm going to wield my power however I'd like, and I'm going to take the journal or the conference or the department that I run in my direction according to my desires. Or we can be a bit more humble and adopt an attitude of humility and say, I don't know it all, and I need help. I can't do this on my own, and if I did it on my own, it wouldn't be as good, right?
Right, yeah.
And so instead, I aspire for that. I aspire to seek out help and input and every chance I get, which I've been lucky to have great colleagues who are willing to work with me and share their thoughts and encourage me in certain directions. And share their expertise. So I benefit tremendously from that.
I really appreciate the spirit of humility, and I think our listeners will too. And with the degree of sort of kind of influence, even with your spirit of humility, about where the field should go, sort of in the future. If you could name, I don't know, one or two things that you would like to see in the future of the study of religion, what would it be? I'm not asking
Yeah.
you to be an authoritarian or something
Right.
like that.
No, but
yeah,
I mean something
yeah,
that I've privileged as editor, and
Yeah.
I've encouraged repeatedly at conferences and calls to my colleagues about the kind of work I'd like to see published in the journal. I keep asking for more disciplinary reflexivity. And what I mean by that is I think we need to do more thinking about the ways in which the discipline itself internalizes social norms, and in ways those norms affect the kinds of scholarship we do, what questions we ask, what communities we study and don't study. And so I'd like to see more disciplinary reflexivity around, work like asking how are we ourselves becoming a neoliberal capitalist institution, higher education, and journal publishing and book publishing. These are all now industries. And so how does that affect what can be said and what is said? And there's always room for reflection on racial dynamics, gender dynamics, class dynamics in the academy. And I think this kind of reflexivity can only improve the quality of our work. The more we become aware of privilege and power dynamics within our own institutions, the better we can speak about them out there in the world. So it's another kind of humility, right?
Yeah.
Calling for a sort of disciplinary humility.
Yeah, discipline. Yeah.
We are not already fully aware of ourselves. We need to do some work there.
Yeah. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. Maybe this is a kind of a too simple of a way of putting it, but it's kind of like you're pointing to there's an inherent sort of conflict of interest with regard to sort of religious studies or any field, in that you're saying that this is an industry, and so you would never get a religious studies professor say, you know what, religion is really not that important to study.
Right.
It's like they have to say it's important to study because that's why they take a paycheck, right?
Right.
So there's some sort of inherent conflict of interest that you're calling for to be explored in much more complicated and nuanced ways than me just putting it that sort of bluntly or simply or something like that.
Yeah.
I like that. I really I value reflexivity and introspection, and I just want to thank you for spending time with me today on this episode. It's great to have you here in Houston, and we wish you all the best.
Well, thank you. It's like coming home. So I was really pleased to be here. Thanks.
Thank you.